Crime scenes can offer investigators a wealth of information about how a crime occurred and how the victim died. A forensic laboratory can uncover even more valuable information when investigating the evidence surrounding the victim's cause of death. It's amazing what science can tell us about how and when and under what circumstances a person died. For instance, one ingenious procedure measures the amount of potassium in the eyes of the deceased in order to pinpoint the time of death. Now, in the case for Christ, everything hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. After all, anybody can claim to be the Son of God, as Jesus clearly did. The issue is, did he back it up? Because if Jesus really did return from the dead, then that's conclusive confirmation of his divine identity. Of course, we don't have modern forensics as we investigate the demise of Jesus. But nevertheless, we can look at medical evidence surrounding his death, as well as other historical evidence concerning his return from the grave. The resurrection of Jesus really is the pivotal event of history. Anybody can claim to be the Son of God, as Jesus clearly did. The question is, can you back it up? What evidence is there to support your claim? What credentials do you have? And if Jesus really did return from the dead, that's excellent evidence that he is who he claimed to be, the one and only Son of God.
To weigh the validity of Jesus' resurrection, we must first consider his death. Many skeptics have proposed that Jesus merely fainted on the cross, or was drugged, and later escaped as part of a conspiracy. By contrast, the four gospel narratives collectively describe the events of his public beating, death by crucifixion, and burial.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
Chances of surviving crucifixion were extremely bleak. Crucifixion and the tortures that normally preceded it was the worst way to die in antiquity. A person was scourged to the point usually that their intestines, arteries, and veins were laid bare. And then after that, a person was dragged out where they were impaled to a cross or a tree and then left hanging there in excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from the Latin, out of the cross.
Jesus was being tried and executed as a rebel leader. Now, in the Roman army, if you were responsible for looking after one prisoner of war, even if he was a rather insignificant prisoner of war, if you let him get away, your life would be forfeit in place of his, and life was very cheap. If you were looking after the execution of a rebel leader and you let him get away, you're in deep trouble. You're not going back home to your wife and kids. No way, game over. The Romans were very, very good at killing people. They specialized in it. They prided themselves on it.
If Jesus really was killed by the Romans, if his body really was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, then the next focus of my investigation became obvious. On the first Sunday after the crucifixion, was the tomb of Jesus Christ really empty?
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Luke 24:1.
The empty tomb story also has a very embarrassing feature of it that is preserved in the memory of the early church, namely the discovery of the empty tomb by women. Now, in order to appreciate this, you have to understand something of the status of women in Palestinian Jewish society. In that society, which was a patriarchal society, women were frankly second-class citizens.
If you were going to invent an account about an empty tomb, then why on earth would you invent witnesses, primary witnesses, whom no one would believe? In fact, they would scoff at that later on.
Supposing you were inventing the story of the resurrection of Jesus, many people have said, oh, this was all just dreamed up later on. Well, how would you have done that? The one thing you wouldn't have done would have been to have not only a woman, but a woman who's got nobody quite knows what, but a fairly shady past, as your prime witness. And yet there she is, Mary Magdalene, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and particularly in John. And already by the middle of the 2nd century, the pagans are sneering, oh, this is just based on the testimony of hysterical women, you can't believe that. But the early Christians stuck to their story, they stuck to their guns, they stuck to the women. They said, this is how it was. Now, they just would never have made that up. And that actually has enormous ramifications. If this is how the story was, and they didn't change it to airbrush Mary out, then this really must have been what happened on that first Easter day.
The chief priests devised a plan. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." Matthew 28:12 and 13.
Matthew reports that the Jewish authorities were claiming that the disciples of Jesus had stolen his corpse. And this is verified by Justin and Tertullian a little bit later on, saying that the Jewish leaders were still saying the same thing in their day. Now here's the question. If the body is still in the tomb, why are you saying that the disciples had stolen it?
Well, if you think about that, the claim that the body was stolen confirms that Jesus' enemies acknowledged that the tomb was empty. If you've got a stolen body, you must have an empty tomb. If the tomb was not empty, Jesus' opponents would surely have gone and got the body and shown it as soon as the disciples began proclaiming the resurrection.
I found the evidence for the empty tomb very convincing, but you know what? That didn't tell me what happened to Jesus. Is it true that hundreds of people really saw him alive after the crucifixion? My research took me to a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and it contains the earliest passage of all about what happened to the resurrected Jesus.
He was raised on the third day. He appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me. 1 Corinthians 15:4-8.
Paul, who is a first-generation Christian, having met and seen the resurrected Jesus, describes resurrection appearances to Peter, to the apostles, to James, and finally to himself. And he also mentions 500 people who saw Jesus alive. So we have eyewitness first-hand account of someone who himself saw Jesus alive and knows of 500 people or so who saw Jesus alive. That's extraordinarily strong evidence.
These people, Paul tells us, were still alive at the time that he was telling the Corinthians about it. And his implication is we have hundreds of people who actually saw Jesus risen from the dead. If you don't believe me, you can ask them about it because they're still alive.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells the Corinthian church that he passed on what he received. He uses the language, actually, of a formal transfer of tradition. What he received, and then he describes the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection appearances. This confirms for us that the accounts of the resurrection were creedal tradition that were passed on to Paul. So if 1 Corinthians was written in the early to mid-50s of the first century, these traditions were much earlier than that. going back to the period of Paul's conversion in the 30s. So that pushes the accounts of the resurrection to a very, very early date.
Paul seems to think that the best argument for this text is that he received it from trustworthy persons. I gave you what I was given. The answer's right. I went to the right people. And critics believe that Paul got this material. Generally, they say he received it in Jerusalem about 35 AD.
First of all, he's early. He's writing within 20 to 35 years of the purported event itself, because he's quoting from a creed, an oral formula, tradition that predates the writing of the New Testament, for which most scholars date to between 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself.
1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 provides evidence that belief in the resurrection was already present among Jews within 2 to 3 years after Jesus was killed. That means that the resurrection stories aren't something that evolved over 30, 40, 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus.
When we look at the various kinds of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the medical evidence that he was killed by crucifixion, the evidence for the tomb being empty on that first Easter morning, the evidence of hundreds of eyewitnesses who were described in accounts so early that they cannot be legendary, you put all of this together, I think you have a powerful case that Jesus did indeed return from the dead and thus prove he's the Son of God. And we're not done yet. There's actually one more category of evidence that we're going to consider next week. But I just wanted to pause right now, because this is more than just a cerebral exercise. There are very personal implications to the resurrection. I remember when my mother was dying of cancer, how often our conversation would drift to the resurrection of Jesus. Why? Because if Jesus returned from the dead, then she could have confidence as she would someday too. It meant that there was hope. It meant that because he was still alive, that she would be alive forever with him. So where would you say, personally for you, the evidence is pointing right now? Toward or away from Jesus being divine?